War can be nasty, very nasty. It can be vicious and cruel, bringing out the very worst in people, making them do inhumane things they wouldn't dream of doing under normal circumstances. War crimes happen all the time in the fog of war. The Second World War was no different. It was a global conflict full of alleged war crimes, many of them unfortunately all too true. Then there are those events that are controversial, not as easy to verify as war crimes. In this video, we'll examine the case of HMS Torbay, a British submarine whose commander was said to have committed not one, but 2 war crimes. And the question will be asked, were they war crimes? Rear Admiral Sir Anthony Cecil Capel Miers was born on November 11, 1906, in the Scottish city of Inverness. He was well educated, having attended Edinburgh Academy and Wellington College, both of them private schools for the well-off. He joined the Royal Navy in 1924 at age 19 as a special entry cadet. By 1929, he had volunteered for the submarine service. His first submarine command commenced in 1936 with HMS L-54, when he was barely 30 years old. He would then go on to serve on the battleship HMS Iron Duke before becoming a lieutenant commander within the higher echelons of the Home Fleet between 1939 and 1940. It was in November 1940, with the war just over a year old, that Miers was made commander of the submarine, HMS Torbay. Lieutenant Commander Miers could be eccentric. One ritual of his was dubbed Usual Drill Number 1, which was a special salute, so to speak, that his crew gave sailors aboard ships belonging to Vichy France every time they entered port in Alexandria, Egypt. Basically, his crew would assemble on deck and, on the order of Anthony Miers, would drop their pants and moon the Vichy French sailors. That's British naval humor at its best. Anthony Miers was not an easy man to like, and his temperament and personality are well worth exploring, given what he would be accused of. It was well known in submarine circles that he could be very hot-tempered. He was court-martialed in 1933 for having hit a sailor. His rank and file were known to dread his often volcanic eruptions, which could even result in a black eye for the poor man on the receiving end. He was referred to rather euphemistically throughout his career as a ball of fire, and as being one of the Royal Navy's most controversial officers. He was short and stocky with a penetrating glare, who one fellow officer described as being totally loyal, outstandingly keen, fearless, hot-tempered, and incautiously spoken. Other officers would comment behind his back how his language and vitriol could strip paint. He was known, however, to be charming when he wanted and was not a man to bear grudges. Well, at least that. However, his bad temper and troublesome personality didn't hinder Miers in terms of his career in the Royal Navy. And why should it have? After all, this was a branch of the services that had a centuries-old tradition of having some of the meanest, most cruel military leaders imaginable. He was in good company, and his excellent naval skills more than made up for his many shortcomings as a person. Miers would be awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions undertaken at the helm of HMS Torbay in the harbor of the Greek island of Corfu in March 1942. He was feted in the newspapers and would even earn the nickname of Nazi Public Enemy No. 1. As for the submarine in our story, HMS Torbay, with pennant number N79, was a T-class submarine which was laid down at Chatham Dockyard in November 1938 and launched on April 9, 1940. She was 275 feet or 84 meters in length, being 26 foot 6 inches or just over 8 meters across her beam. She could attain a top speed of 15.25 knots or 28.2 kilometers per hour when at surface, and 9 knots or 17 kilometers per hour when submerged. Torbay served primarily in the Mediterranean. Her first offensive patrol was in March 1941 when she sailed from Portsmouth south to intercept the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which were making their way back to Brest in France. She didn't find them and was ordered then to join the first flotilla at Alexandria, Egypt. From that base, she would sink a number of ships in the next 12 months, including the Italian submarine Giantina. One of her most famous sorties took place on August 22, 1941, when she took on 130 soldiers hailing from Britain, Australia, and New Zealand from the island of Corfu, and safely transported them to Alexandria. That feat has been cited as a record of men jammed into one submarine on a voyage. HMS Torbay would sink 12 Greek, 5 German, and 5 Italian sailing vessels, 4 Italian merchant ships, 4 Italian auxiliary patrol vessels, a German troop ship, a German army cargo ship, and 1 merchant ship each from France and Denmark, among other smaller vessels. Her final tally was 5 warships, 17 merchant ships, and 24 sailing vessels totaling 38,000 tons. So, what happened for HMS Torbay and its commander, Anthony Miers, to be charged with allegations of war crimes? The night in question was July 9, 1941. It has been stated by various sources that on that night, Miers ordered that several shipwrecked German soldiers in rafts be machine-gunned to death, including those Germans who had jumped overboard and were struggling in the water. One person on board HMS Torbay who witnessed and reported what happened was Acting First Lieutenant Paul Chapman. In his words, "Everything and everybody was destroyed by one sort of gunfire or another." By that, Chapman referred to all the German soldiers in rafts and in the water. And that order was given twice during the night, which is why it is claimed that Miers committed 2 acts of war crimes on July 9, 1941. To call these unsubstantiated allegations is both trite and nonsense, since Miers himself was very open about his actions and made no attempt to conceal them. He plainly recorded in his patrol log the following: "Submarine cast off, and with the Lewis gun accounted for the soldiers in the rubber raft to prevent them from regaining their ship. That is naval speak for, we shot everything we could." Admiral Max Horton, flag officer submarines, was reportedly horrified when he heard about what Miers had done. He was extremely concerned about German reprisals and wrote as such to the Admiralty. The words of Admiral Horton were fierce and very clear. He wrote, "As far as I am aware, the enemy has not made a habit of firing on personnel in the water or on rafts even when such personnel were members of the fighting services. Since the incidents referred to in Torbay's report, he may feel justified in doing so." The Admiralty responded by sending Miers a strongly worded letter in which he was warned not to repeat such actions as he did that night in July 1942. Miers never denied what he had ordered that night, nor was there any evidence of remorse on his part, at least not in the public domain, and he was certainly never court-martialed or sanctioned in any way for what he did. So, was Anthony Miers a war criminal? Yes, based on the verified evidence and what constitutes a war crime under international law. He most certainly was, and no amount of reasons can justify what he did as anything but war crimes. British apologies for what Miers did also reek of hypocrisy. After all, the British had seen fit to have German U-boat commander Heinz Wilhelm Eck shot dead by firing squad for having ordered the shooting of survivors of a Greek merchant ship that his U-boat had sunk. 2 other officers were also sentenced to death along with Eck for those war crimes. The Anthony Miers scandal only really came to light in 1989 with a book published by Ludovic Kennedy titled On the Way to My Club, and in which wrote several pages about what he referred to as a submarine atrocity. Kennedy was a prolific and acclaimed historian and, like Miers, was a fellow Scotsman who had also seen active service with the Royal Navy during World War II. The war crimes Miers committed weren't even unique among British warships. In 1979, the historian Alfred Maurice de Zayas published his book The Wehrmacht War Crimes Bureau, 1939 to 1945, in which he cited several instances of Royal Navy warships sinking Greek ships that were transporting German soldiers, only to then open fire on survivors in the water or in lifeboats. No wonder Miers never got into any trouble with what he did. Anthony Miers would go on to serve as submarine liaison officer to the American Pacific Fleet and would be commander submarines of the 8th Submarine Flotilla based in what was then Ceylon and today Sri Lanka. After the war, he would go on to be commanding officer of various warships as well as the Royal Naval College in Greenwich, among other postings. He would be promoted to Rear Admiral in January 1956 and would retire in August 1959. He was given a Companion of the Order of the Bath or CB in 1958 and would be made Sir Anthony Miers in 1959. He died at his home in Roehampton, London on June 30, 1985, aged 79, and buried in his hometown of Inverness, Scotland. Here's an interesting tidbit about Anthony Miers when he was a boy and pupil at Wellington College. One of his tutors predicted that the young Miers would go on to either be court-martialed or win the Victoria Cross. Anthony Miers, ever the maverick so well suited to the Royal Navy, achieved both. As for his Victoria Cross, it can be seen on proud display today at the Imperial War Museum in London. Even war criminals remain heroes in the eyes of some.